Our next lesson in the Civil War is called Petersburg and Atlanta. Our objectives are to describe the hardships the Union Army faced on the way to Petersburg, recognize the Union Army's march to Atlanta and the effects it had on Southern people. Look at your vocabulary words. Something that exists as an object or thing is entity. Any weapons and shells used for war are munitions. A pattern of undesirable symptoms that indicate fear or illness is syndrome. Great physical or mental strength and energy is vigor. To diminish or lessen in value or power is wane. Come on, Buford, just let it go, man. Not without a fight, you rascally bird. Your parents come up to you one day and say, if you get the house cleaned up real nice, including your room, we'll let you hang out with your friends this weekend. Is there motivation to do the work? You bet. In no time at all, everything is white glove clean and you're ready to have a blast. But here's another scenario. Your friends come up to you one day and say, if you get the house cleaned up real nice, including your room, we'll let you vacuum the rugs, clean the oven, and wash the car. Is there motivation to do the work? Not a chance. This illustration might help you understand the situation with Grant's army. It seemed like the general was saying, if you guys go out in the next battle and run across the field so the Confederates can mow you down with their muskets and cannons, I'll let you do it again next week. Is there motivation in that? Yeah, right. But that's exactly what they were being asked to do. Today's lesson briefly describes the tale of two armies. Grant's men were being asked to make unbelievable sacrifices in the face of a determined enemy, while Sherman's army was asked to march on Atlanta, where the Confederates did not have the manpower to stand in their way. One was disheartened by enormous losses, while the other was motivated to attack deep into the enemy's turf. Ultimately, the outcome of the war depended on the successes or failures of these two armies. If they failed, President Lincoln would more than likely lose his job, and the Union would dissolve into two separate entities. Okay, so go ahead and put today's date in your lesson. Let's see, and they're going to Petersburg. So let's put road to Petersburg. Attacking strong defensive fortifications brought about great horror and anxiety to Grant's army. For a number of days, fighting had taken place in central Virginia. Since May 4th, the Federals had lost 65,000 casualties. No one could take such punishment and maintain their aggressiveness. Now, on the evening of June 12th, Army of the Potomac withdrew and began to move once again toward Petersburg. The men had seen a great amount of death and destruction, and their fighting spirit had suffered the consequences. A type of post-traumatic stress syndrome caused men to be less aggressive and more likely to retreat instead of pressing their opponents to the limit. It would even cause soldiers to desert in the face of battle. Even though the defenses around Petersburg appeared breakable, this was not the same army Grant had started with on his march into the wilderness. Union Army was not the only one suffering. The Confederate Army was just as devastated by the constant conflict. Throw in a lack of nourishment and clothing, and one would see an army barely hanging on. Even so, between June 15th and 18th, the Union Army missed many opportunities to break the Confederate position at Petersburg. Corps commanders executed orders sluggishly, and troops did not move when or where they were supposed to, or with the vigor expected of a disciplined army. Okay, so both the Union and the Confederates were suffering from the war. Okay. The armies okay, we're going to say the Union. Now remember, Grant is fighting an army of attrition. They just keep attacking to make the Confederates weak, but it's making them weak as well. Remember, the Union had 65,000 casualties. You know, within a month. So they've lost a lot of soldiers. So it's making them depressed. So with this is traumatic. That's not spelled right, is it? There's a U there somewhere. Okay, it's T-R-A-U. Stress syndrome. They were less aggressive. It says that some of them retreated, some retreated, It said the Confederates were also suffering. We talked about the Union, now the Confederates. Now remember, they're not doing very well either. Because they're not eating right. So they have a food shortage. You ever go while without enough to eat, you start getting cranky, you start, well, they have a food shortage and a shortage on clothes. Okay, so the Union Army missed many chances of defeating the Confederates. They could have defeated them a lot quicker. So the Union passed up opportunities. To beat the Confederates. Okay, we said that on the road to Petersburg, the Union had 65,000 casualties within the last month. 65,000 soldiers that died in the war. This brought about traumatic stress syndrome. It made them less aggressive. Some even retreated. The Confederates had all of this. Plus, they had a food shortage and a shortage on clothes. So this caused the Union to pass up opportunities to beat the Confederates. Why Petersburg? Petersburg lay just south of the Confederate capital of Richmond. It was the primary transportation hub of the capital as well as much of the South. For major railroads ran to the city as it lay alongside the Appomattox River. If the Northern Army could attack and defeat the city, Richmond would be completely cut off from the rest of the Confederacy. Okay, so they know the major town they need to beat is Richmond, so they're trying to get to Richmond. So, why Petersburg? Okay. Number one, it was just south of the capital. Now remember, the Confederate capital is Richmond, Virginia. Just south of the Confederate capital. Of Richmond, Virginia. And number two was the primary transportation hub of the capital. Primary supposed to be an H. Primary transportation hub. Of Richmond. And it would cut off or separate if they could attack Richmond, then if they could attack Petersburg, Richmond would be out of reach of the Confederacy. In other words, it would be cut off from the Confederates. Okay. It would separate Richmond from Confederacy. The Union would be between them. Okay. So why Petersburg? Because it's just south of the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Petersburg is the primary transportation hub of Richmond, and it would separate Richmond. It separates Richmond from the Confederacy. Knowing the importance of this city, Grant decided to switch gears. The recent horrific battles had taken their toll on his men. Rather than continue the war of attrition, he decided to sidestep the Confederate army and head to Petersburg. Once there, Grant figured he could starve the rebel army into submission. Seeing the Union Army on the move, Robert E. Lee mistakenly assumed the enemy was making a move directly toward Richmond. Therefore, he sent a great portion of his army to defend the capital and deployed a much smaller force to protect Petersburg. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. Now remember, Grant's been fighting this war of attrition where he just keeps attacking, and his goal is to wear the Confederates out. But now he's switched gears. Now he's going to basically siege the city. He's going to he figured he can starve the rebel army into submission. So Grant decided he's going to lay hold of Petersburg. Now Lee sees them moving. Lee thinks that Grant is going to Richmond. So Lee sent a large portion of his army to Richmond. So Lee sent large army to protect Richmond. So he only has a small army to protect Petersburg. That may not be too bad, because if Grant starves the people in Petersburg, it's just a small portion of Lee's army. So that, I don't know, that may not have been too bad. When the Union troops first arrived, General Benjamin Butler sent nearly 5,000 men into the city. They were quickly defeated by a makeshift army of 10,000 old and young boys. This bought some time for Confederate Beauregard to fortify the city. As you will read later, his efforts convinced the Union military command that a vast army awaited them. Rather than undergo another devastating battle, the Union army stopped its advance outside the city. This proved to be the first of several major blunders. Okay, so Grant changed his strategy. He decided to lay hold of Petersburg and starve them. Lee misunderstood what he was doing, so he sent a large army to protect Richmond, and there was only a small army to protect Petersburg. Well, when the Union army first arrived, okay, so they're in Petersburg. General Butler sent 5,000 into the city. Okay, and it said they were beat, so the Union was defeated. They were defeated by an army of old men and young boys. Old men and young boys. So all the people there that weren't eligible to be in the military was the army that defeated the Union in Petersburg. Okay. Now it said because of this, Confederate General Beauregard see if I can spell this right. B-E-A-U Beauregard was able to fortify the city. And so General Grant, instead of General Grant just continue fighting, he decided to stop. So Grant stopped his advance on the city. He thought the army there was too large. He thought that Lee had a large army there. Okay, Grant decided to lay hold of Petersburg. Lee sent a large army to protect Richmond and only a small army to protect Petersburg. But what happened when Grant went to attack Petersburg, this army of old men and young boys quickly defeated them. And this gave Confederate General Beauregard time to fortify the city. Grant stopped his advance on the city because he thought Lee had a large army there. But remember, this wasn't even his army. This was just a group of old men and young boys. Okay, so let's talk about the road to Atlanta. The fall of first Vicksburg and then Chattanooga had opened the way to the south. It was after the latter, which is Chattanooga. After the latter, General Grant decided upon a plan of action to end the war. For the first time, a Union general planned a multi-pronged attack on the South. He would take a large army and engage Lee's forces through the heart of Virginia. The Deep South was entrusted to his friend William Sherman. Atlanta, Georgia was a key city to the South's ability to wage war for two reasons. First, it was a major transportation hub for the Deep South. In addition, much of the Confederate Army's munitions were made there. Capturing Atlanta became a natural military target. Second, Sherman understood that one way to defeat an enemy was to take away their fighting spirit. If he could defeat the will of civilians at home, this would undermine the war effort on the front. Okay. So what's going on here is Grant decided upon a multi-pronged attack. Okay, so we're going to talk about the road to Atlanta. So Grant has a new strategy now. Grant is planting a multi-pronged attack. Okay. He's going to engage Lee's forces through the heart of Virginia. So he's going to fight Lee in the heart of Virginia. Okay. All right, and it looks like he wants, his goal is Atlanta, Georgia. And it says, Atlanta, Georgia was a key to the South's ability to wage war. Key to the South's ability to wage war. And it says for 2 reasons. Okay, for 2 reasons. 1 is a major transportation hub. It said that it was a major transportation hub. They said, in addition, much of the Confederate Army's munitions were there. Much of their shells and equipment for the war were held there. So much of the Confederates' munitions were there. Okay, number 2, second, Sherman understood that one way to defeat an enemy was to take away their fighting spirit. He wants to defeat the will of the civilians at home. Defeat the will of the civilians. Remember, the civilians are the people that are not at war. At home. Therefore, while Grant was taking on Lee's army in Virginia, Sherman would sweep through the deep South, destroying any hope of Lee being able to replenish his army as the war dragged on. Okay. So Grant has a multi-pronged attack. He wants to fight Lee in the heart of Virginia. Atlanta, Georgia became the key to the South's ability to wage the war for 2 reasons. Number 1, it was a major transportation hub, and much of the Confederates' munitions were there. Number 2, he wanted to defeat the will of the civilians at home. So, while Grant is fighting Lee in Virginia, Sherman is going to sweep through the deep South. So Sherman is going to go through the deep South. The only thing standing in the way of this objective was Confederate Army under General Joseph Johnston. As the Atlanta campaign began to unfold, so this became known as the Atlanta campaign because they're after Atlanta, it became clear that Confederate General Johnston was not interested in butting heads with the Union Army. That's kind of funny. So the only thing standing in their way was let's talk about Confederate General Johnson. Any more than necessary. He was known as an overly cautious leader who did his best to avoid such bloody conflicts. As a result, once Sherman began to move south toward Atlanta, Johnson decided to take a defensive position. So Johnson was more of a cautious leader. And we've talked about a lot of them, didn't we? He was a cautious leader. So when Sherman was coming towards him, he took a defensive posture. The idea was to make the Union general attack him. Okay, so he wanted Sherman to attack him. Johnson understood that a 19th century army, in theory, could not be too far removed from its supply line. It was hoped that Sherman would get so far into enemy territory that he would then become vulnerable to attacks in his rear, thereby cutting off his supplies. Sherman had anticipated this, and though difficult, he was able to keep the Confederate cavalry busy enough that his supplies kept on coming. Okay, so Grant came up with a multi-pronged attack. Grant was going to fight Lee in the heart of Virginia. Atlanta, Georgia became the key to the South's ability to wage war for two reasons. Number one, it was a major transportation hub. It held much of the Confederates' munitions. Number two, he knew that one way to win the war was to defeat the will of the civilians at home. And while Grant's doing that, Sherman's going to fight into the deep South. The one standing in his way was Confederate General Johnson. He was a cautious leader, and he wanted Sherman to attack him. So let's talk about Johnson's strategy. We said that Johnson understood that the Union couldn't be too far away from its supply line. So he knew that he wanted Sherman to get so far into enemy territory. Okay. Johnson thought Sherman was close to his supply line. And remember, the South needs supplies. So Johnson's goal was to, once Sherman got in the Confederate territory far enough, he was going to attack him from the rear. Attack from the rear. So Johnson wants to attack Sherman from the rear. Which would separate Sherman from his supplies. That's a horrible E. But Sherman, remember, Sherman was ranked pretty high, and Sherman figured out what Johnson was doing. It sounded like a good plan, but Sherman figured it out. Okay, so Sherman figured out Johnson's plan. And he was able to prevent Johnson from separating him from his supplies. So his supplies kept coming. He was never separated from his supplies. Finally, Johnson, like many Southerners, understood that support for the war was waning in the North. If he was not able to defeat the Federal Army, he hoped to at least delay the capture of Atlanta. The longer the war went, the more they could influence the November elections to the point where Lincoln could be defeated at the polls. It was already understood that a new president would bring peace. Okay. So the only thing standing between Sherman and Atlanta, Georgia was General Johnson. He was cautious, and his plan was he wanted Sherman to attack him. He figured Sherman was close to his supply line, and he planned to attack Sherman from the rear and separate Sherman from his supplies. But Sherman figured out Johnson's plan, and he was able to keep that from happening. So his supplies kept coming. Okay. Okay, so Johnson's trying to keep them from attacking Atlanta. Once Sherman began to move south toward Atlanta, Johnson set his army in a constant defensive mode. He would get ahead of Sherman, set up entrenchments, and dare the Union to attack. Okay. So Johnson got ahead of Sherman. Set up entrenchments. And he dared the Union to attack. So remember, he wants the Union to attack him. He's trying to delay them from getting to Atlanta. Dared Union to attack. Not wanting to make a suicidal frontal assault, Sherman simply moved his army around the position. So Sherman didn't fight. Sherman just went around them because he wanted to save his men for the war in Atlanta, for the battle in Atlanta. So he just went around the South instead of fighting them. This type of warfare set the stage for a series of small battles known as the Atlanta Campaign, which ultimately resulted in the fall of Atlanta in September of 1864. So Johnson got ahead of Sherman and set up entrenchments and dared the Union to attack. Sherman went around the South. He went around the Southern Army. And it said this: set the stage for the Atlanta Campaign. which were small battles. And it says the Atlanta fell. In other words, the Union overtook Atlanta. Atlanta fell in September 1864. Okay, let's review. Before completing the problem set, make sure you understand the main points of the lesson. After the fall of Chattanooga, Tennessee, Grant decided upon a two-pronged attack on the Confederates. He would engage the forces of Robert E. Lee in Virginia. The war of attrition would result in thousands of casualties while taking away the Confederacy's will to fight. However, the horrific battles in such a short span of time caused his own army to waver, which resulted in a protracted siege of Petersville. The second major assault would be against Atlanta. Here Sherman would make his way south until he captured the Georgia capital. The initial Battle of Petersburg resulted in a Union defeat at the hands of old men and young boys guarding the city. After that, Confederate General Beauregard gave the appearance that he had a much larger army than he really did. As a result, the Union Army was hesitant to attack the city early on, giving Lee time to bring in reinforcements. In the South, Confederate General Joseph Johnston refused to get into a major confrontation with Sherman's army. Instead, he set up a series of defensive maneuvers, daring Sherman to attack. The Union general also did not want to take part in bloody frontal assaults, so as Johnston set up entrenchments, Sherman chose to flank them. This created a series of small battles that got closer and closer to Atlanta. Okay, so go ahead and study your lesson, review your notes, and answer the questions.